This is the installation video series for my remote extended runtime fuel tank kit for the Yamaha EF3000iS, EF3000iSE, and EF3000iSEB. As you're possibly well aware, the three different models of generator are all sisters and use the same engine block and housing assembly. This particular unit already has my wireless remote control with the 2,000-foot range installed on it. This particular video will be covering the installation of the fuel kit itself. The first step to installing the fuel kit is to remove portions of the cabinetry. The end covers come off with 4 bolts each. You'll notice that the bolts that hold the end covers on are longer than the bolts that hold the metal covers in place, because these end covers are plastic and they have a bushing in them. But these are 16 millimeter long, 6 millimeter diameter. The fuel tank cover is held on with 4 bolts as well. Go ahead and take a break. Okay, to pull the fuel tank cover off, you undo the 4 bolts, one at each corner of the fuel tank cover. And these bolts are 12 millimeters long instead of 16. Then remove the fuel cap. And it's retained by a chain. So what you'll do is just lift it up and set it sideways. Remove the fuel cap cover, the tank cover, and the fuel cap, when it's turned sideways, can be forced through this rubber gasket. The next step is going to be to remove the fuel tank. When you remove the fuel tank, either make sure that the tank is absolutely out of fuel, or take a pair of crimpers and crimp the fuel line totally shut. There's 2 fuel lines going into the back of the fuel selector valve. The one that goes straight in from the back is the one that comes from the tank. The one that comes around and makes a loop is the one that goes onto the carburetor. So I'm going to reach in and I'm going to crimp the fuel line from the fuel tank completely shut. And then I'll remove the clamp. And then the fuel tank itself is held on with 4 bolts. Incidentally, these 4 bolts are the same length as the 4 bolts that held the fuel tank cover on. Then when you go to lift the fuel tank out of the way, just make sure that what you're using to crimp it with does not get caught on any of the wiring. Slide it up and just lay it on the bottom. On the California approved models, there is a vapor canister. There's two hoses going to the vapor canister. The larger one goes around to the crankcase breather valve. The smaller one goes to a vent on the fuel tank. So you remove the smaller hose from the top of the vapor canister and slowly guide it out of the way as well. And then take your fuel hose and your crimper and lift the fuel tank out of the way. The next step will be to remove the two maintenance panels, and they're held in place with a large Phillips head screw. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a break. Okay, the next step is to remove the valve cover. First, we'll remove the breather hose that goes from the air box into the side of the valve cover. The valve cover is held on with 4 bolts. The valve cover gasket on this one stayed stuck to the cylinder head. The kits come with a replacement valve cover gasket. If you tear the valve cover gasket at all, do not hesitate to use the one that comes with the kit. If you do not tear the valve cover gasket and it comes off clean, then go ahead and save the valve cover gasket. You'll end up using that at some point when you do a valve adjustment later on. Once you get the valve cover off of the generator, you'll notice that there is a recessed area in the valve cover. Line up directly with the end of the recessed area, and you'll see that there's a slight step. So if you put a mark, even with this step, you'll see where this nut is going to line up. With this mark here, and come around to the outside and slide the nut over to where the tip of the nut just barely lines up, even with that mark, and make a dot directly in the center of the nut. That mark is where you're going to drill the hole for the pulse port to go into it. Before drilling the hole for the pulse port, take a pair of ice grips and crimp the inner plate to the valve cover. If you don't crimp them together with a pair of channel locks or something, it is possible for the inner plate to try to slide out and the hole will not line up. I start with a 1/8 drill bit and drill a hole exactly where the dot was made. Once the 1/8 hole is drilled, go back and take a 9/32 drill bit. And drill that hole out to a 9/32 of an inch. Do the best you can to keep the drill bit from catching and pulling through. It's more difficult than it looks. What I do is I keep my thumb over the breather hole so that none of the metal filings go in. If you're a little cautious about that, put a piece of tape over that hole. Once you get the hole cut, you can come back with a burring knife and just knock any slag off the inner cover. We've got just one piece of metal. It's hanging here. Okay. The pulse port has a nut on it. The nut is counterbored on this side and chamfered on the side with the O-ring. So you'll get a pulse port, a 5/16 nut, and a spare elbow fitting, which if you mess this one up, you simply take the O-ring off, take the nut off, observing direction, and put it on the other pulse or the other elbow fitting, and you can discard this one. The other one is simply a spare. The hole is just barely interference fit on the flange of this elbow fitting, but you'll see where the elbow is necked down, that gives you just a slight margin of error for putting this nut on. Take the inner nut and go ahead and thread it onto the elbow fitting. This portion, you want it to split the difference, go about halfway between the breather port or the breather hole and the valve cover gasket surface. About like this. You'll tighten it down till you see the O-ring start to crush down a little bit. When it's about a 1 millimeter thick O-ring, it is squeezed down considerably because the O-ring starts as about a 2 millimeter thick. So when it's down to 1 millimeter, it's crushed significantly. And it'll just barely have a bit of spring to it when you push on it. Okay. You'll notice that the elbow fitting sticks through the nut considerably. I want to trim it to where there's only about a 2 millimeter end because I do not want the elbow fitting to touch the rocker arms in here. because what that'll do is it'll feed on this, make it come loose later on. And what I do is I take a razor blade and I actually trim it at an angle. So as you can see, at this edge it's only about 1 millimeter, and at this edge it's about 2 millimeters down here. And that is the pulse port. And that's probably a good place to take a break. Okay, when you get ready to put it back on, position the valve cover gasket into the valve cover. Hold the breather hose out of the way. Slide the valve cover onto the cylinder head. There's a piece of foam insulation that sticks over the corner of this valve cover. Make sure the valve cover goes behind that. And go ahead and start the 4 valve cover bolts loosely before tightening any of them down. Probably as good a place as any to take a break for a minute. And the installation of this bolt may require you to use an end wrench to tighten it down, because the pulse port that this hose goes on actually overlaps the tip of this bolt by about 1 millimeter. So it's a little bit difficult to get a socket on there. So you may have to use an end wrench to tighten down this bolt. Okay, the kit will include approximately 5 feet of 1/4 inch fuel line. Cut a section approximately 12 inches long. Dip one end of it in just a little bit of oil, makes the job a lot easier. You will route that behind the hose that goes to the purge tank and behind the spark plug wire, and it'll slide on to the pulse port that you just installed into the valve cover. So then whenever you snap the spark plug lead back on and put your breather hose back into the valve cover area, you'll notice that the hose we just installed runs behind the spark plug lead, the breather hose, and the purge line, and right next to the stepper motor for the top of the carburetor. Then you're going to need to shine the camera up in here. The fuel pump will sit right in this recessed area, right below the larger of the 2 hoses that goes to the purge canister, which is mounted in this corner here. So the hose that we just cut to length is going to run over, and it's going to go into the pulse port on the top of the fuel pump. Now, like I said earlier, you'll cut the hose just a little bit longer than it needs to be. I cut this one to 13 inches. I'm going to end up trimming about 1.5 inches off of it. I still recommend cutting the hose longer than you think it's going to need to be, because you can always shorten it and you cannot lengthen it once you cut it too short. Since the fuel pump is going to sit like this with the pulse port onto here, I'm going to trim it right at this location. I'm going to dip the end of it in just a little bit of oil because it makes it go on so much easier. And this top port is the pulse port on the fuel pump. You'll take one of the large hose clamps included in the kit. Now, I rotate the hose clamp down simply because it gives you a little bit more room for the next hose clamp. And then test fit it just to make sure that the fuel pump will sit down in there nicely. Because it's going to go under the breather hose. Ultimately, the fuel hose will go inside this clip along with the choke line or the choke wire. Just make sure that you can see that clearly with the camera. This white wire, incidentally, is to the temperature sensor that controls the choke actuator for the remote start. Okay. Now I'm going to remove the hose from the fuel selector valve that goes from the selector valve to the carburetor. This clip used to go onto the choke cable here, and this portion of it used to go onto the fuel line. You'll set that aside momentarily. We're going to leave the other end of this hose connected to the carburetor as opposed to disconnecting it and then trying to reconnect it again. Ultimately, this hose will be cut and connected to the fuel filter, which will set approximately here. The reason why I like the fuel filter to be sitting here is because all you have to do is pull this panel off and you can clearly see the fuel filter at that time. Okay, this is probably as good a point as any to take a break. Okay, if you go from the bend of this hose, and this is the one that used to hook onto the fuel selector valve, go 3 1/4 inches from the inside of the bend. And that is where we're going to cut this hose. Now take this hose with the fuel tee. This fuel tee is supplied with the kit. So you'll notice that the hose bend and the fuel tee are facing the same direction. Then take and cut off a section of the 1/4 inch hose supplied with the kit. There's approximately 5 feet of hose supplied with the kit. Cut a section about 3 1/2 inches long. You're going to trim it to the exact length later. And put that onto the fuel tee at this location. And then take a piece of fuel hose approximately 32 inches long, and put that onto the last fitting of the fuel tee. Then install hose clamps, and they'll be included in the kit. Large hose clamp at this location, large hose clamp at this location, and a small hose clamp at this location. And now, you have to hold the camera up here at the top and film down. You'll see the blower housing, which is this area here, and then the air intake duct. There's a groove where the two of them match. You're going to run the hose underneath the wiring harness that goes for the 12-volt rectifier and around the blower housing, and then curve it back around to where it faces out the front again. And at that point, it should come out underneath the blower housing and out the front access panel here. The reason why I cut this hose at 32 inches long is because it's a lot easier to get a hold of it and pull it out. And now what we're going to do, actually I'm going to go ahead and unplug the temperature sensor for the choke. We'll hook that back up again later. I just want the fuel lines running underneath it. This hose is going to connect back on to the fuel selector valve where it was in the original stock generator. This hose is going to go to the fuel inlet port on the fuel pump, which is this one here. So first we'll go ahead and hook this up to the fuel selector valve. And we're going to use the stock clamp that came on that position. And that's back in place now. Like I said earlier, this particular generator has my remote start on it. And you'll notice the remote start actuator sits right here, and there's just enough room for the fuel line to run underneath the choke actuator. Then this hose that we trimmed, we cut off at 3.5 inches, will plug on to the inlet port on the carburetor, or on the fuel pump, excuse me. And then we'll put a large hose clamp in that location. At this point, you can reconnect the choke actuator if the generator you're working on happens to have an electric choke on it and one of my remote start. I wanted to clarify the routing of the fuel line. This is the hose that hooks on to the fuel selector valve. You can see the elbow where it goes around. It then passes underneath the linear actuator for the choke if your generator has also got the wireless remote start kit of mine on it. This is the T with the 3.5-inch piece of tubing that connects to the fuel pump inlet. And this is the hose that I initially trimmed to 32 inches, and it lays right in the groove between the blower housing and the plastic fan shroud. It then goes right down, follows the line of the groove, and tucks in behind the air box and carburetor. If you come over to this view, you can see the hose as it goes along the gap. It then goes back under the engine and comes out at this side here. And there is where it's connected on to the quick disconnect fitting. I initially routed the hose through as a 32-inch hose because it's a whole lot easier to grab a hold of the end of it. I then trimmed 10 inches off of the hose, so on this particular generator it's left with a 22-inch hose. And anywhere between 21 and 23 is perfectly acceptable depending on how tight you pull it. It seems to work out that about 22 is pretty good for me. If the generator you're working on happens to have an electric choke on it and one of my remote start kits. Now there's one more port left on the fuel pump, and this port goes from the output line of the fuel pump. It'll come around and it'll go onto the fuel filter, which what we're going to do is take the shield that's on the stock hose and we're going to slide it down. Easier said than done. You notice there's an inner hose and an outer shield. Now when you route this hose around, make certain that it does not catch on the wire that pulls the choke if you're running one of my one of my electric start kits. We're going to go ahead and hook the fuel filter to this hose. We use a small hose clamp in this location because the stock Yamaha hose is a thinner diameter, thinner wall than the hose supplied with the kit. And then we'll go ahead and slide the abrasion guard that's around the stock hose right up against the hose clamp. So now the fuel line is going to run up around the top of the air filter, up to the fuel filter, and then we're going to take another section of hose and run from the output on the pump to the input on the fuel filter. Now I originally started with the hose that I ran around here to be about 32 inches long. When you trim off the end of it, you will have enough hose to run from the output of the fuel pump to the input on the fuel filter. If you started with this hose at less than 32 inches, you won't have enough to do that with this. You'll have to use another piece of hose. I got caught in my throat. Let's take a break. Okay, the piece of hose that I had left over that I trimmed off of the 32-inch line that I had running out the front is not quite long enough to do the job. So I'm taking the rest of the hose that's supplied with the kit, and I'm going to connect one end onto the output port on the fuel pump. Lay the fuel pump back down into place. I'm going to take the output line and wrap it around so that it connects onto the fuel filter in such a way that it doesn't force any sharp kinks. I'll line it up, select my place to cut the end off. I'm going to come right out here. Incidentally, the piece of hose I'm using here is 15 inches long. Take that, plug it onto your fuel filter, and simply route the fuel filter to where it lays up in this area right here, so that whenever you go to check the fuel filter in the future, you can just reach up and grab the fuel filter and pull it down so it's visible through this inspection cover. So what I'm going to do now is put a large hose clamp in this location. Another large hose clamp on the pump itself, on the output port. This way it all sits down in there nice and snug. Now if you come around to the front, you'll find the hose that we had trimmed off. It's right here. What we're going to do is we're going to drill a hole into this panel, and we're going to mount our quick disconnect fitting at this location. If you take a flashlight and shine it behind here, you'll notice that there is an engine mount at this location, right at the edge of the inspection cover. So we definitely cannot go here. We must go back to just in front of the plastic area. You'll notice that this is made of plastic. So if we drill our hole in front of that, that's where we'll mount our quick disconnect fitting. I drilled the pilot hole at a 1/8 inch. 2/2 of an inch. Now, I use a step drill. If you have a step drill, go ahead and use it. If not, use whatever you have. But the hole for this is going to allow the quarter pipe fitting to go in. You can go ahead and shut that off if you want to while I finish drilling this hole out. Okay, this is the quick disconnect fitting that comes in the kit. This is called a quarter pipe fitting. It is just slightly larger than a 1/2 inch. I've got this hole drilled to a 1/2 inch now because I want the fitting to go very tight. I'm not going to drill it all the way to a 9/16, so I'm going to take a repairman's reamer. Two things about it: the repairman's reamer will remove any burrs that were left by the drill bit, as well as reaming it out just slightly larger than a 1/2 inch. Couple of methods for this. You could take a drill bit, a 1/2 inch, and just wallow it a little bit, or drill it to a 9/16 if you do not have a repairman's reamer. Okay, make it nice and tight. At this point, take the brass hose barb included in the kit and thread it on to one of the quick disconnect fittings, and check the gap right through here. You'll notice there's an inspection plug right here, so you can see how much play you're going to have. And all I'm doing is feeling to see if there's a little bit of play around this. If, when you assemble it, if you start feeling tension on the threads when it's way back here, you'll notice that it won't quite pinch tightly around this piece of metal and yet close in this gap, which will allow this to spin back and forth. At that point, you would have to use the large washer that's included in the kit as a shim. What you would do is just put the large washer around it and pass it through this. This particular unit definitely will not require that. Take the roll of Teflon tape that's included in the kit and wrap it several layers thick around the threads of the quick disconnect fitting. Do not overlap the edge. If you were to overlap the edge like this or something, that portion will get sheared off, and if you're lucky, it will make it all the way through to the fuel filter and get caught there. If you're unlucky, it will cause an obstruction before it gets to the fuel filter, or stick in one of the fuel pump check valves and hang it open so that the fuel pump does not work properly. Go ahead and take a break. Okay. Ultimately, when I'm setting these up, I want the fuel fittings to face forward. That way the fuel hose will come around and snap on. Obviously, if it's facing straight up, this lip will prevent you from snapping the fuel line onto it. And if it's facing straight down, that makes it bad. If it's facing straight backwards, you can get it on, but it comes near the wheels and so forth like that. So it either needs to go forward or backward. My own personal preference is to have it face forward. Right now is tightening the hose barb onto the back of the fuel fitting. Okay, so now the hose barb is tightened down. I want this to end up being perfectly parallel to the ground. It's not critical that it's perfectly parallel to the ground, but I like it that way. So, I have to tighten it a little bit more. once you get this adjusted parallel to the ground, you'll take the hose right here that ran around the blower housing and then back under the generator and comes out here. You'll slide it onto the hose barb. Once it's all the way up on the hose barb, you'll take one more large hose clamp and clamp it securely in place. And incidentally, if you don't have a shop vac or something to vacuum up all the metal filings, I would strongly recommend at least taking a magnet and running it around, at least on the inside there if you didn't have a shop vac with a vacuum pickup that can fit down in that area. So I wouldn't want you to leave metal filings inside a brand new generator. Take the rubber hose plug that I removed earlier. Incidentally, the total purpose of this plug is so you can get a wrench to drain the oil. You take a socket straight through here, pull the plug out of the bottom, and drain the oil out through the bottom. That is essentially the installation of the kit. The rest of it is putting the whole cabinetry assembly back together. It's probably as good a place as any to take a break for a moment. Okay, before we get ready to put the cabinet on, you just want to look over everything, make sure that there's no wires that are going to get pinched or anything else when you put the fuel tank on. Make sure that all the hose clamps are in place and that they're all tight. And then it's simply reinstallation of the fuel tank and the rest of the cabinetry. The fuel tank, if you had any fuel in it, you'll have a clamp on the fuel output hose. And then the emissions hose on this corner. The emission hose goes onto the small port. Once you get the hoses on, you'll be able to lean the tank up just a little bit and look in here and make sure that the hoses are nice and smooth flowing. And again, the fuel hose that goes from the tank is the one that goes straight in from the back. At this point, you go ahead and bolt the fuel tank in place. The fuel tank uses the shorter bolts. There are 8 of the short bolts. 4 of them hold the fuel tank on. The other 4 hold the fuel tank cover in place. Cover, you'll have to undo the fuel cap and turn it sideways. Notice when you're putting the fuel tank cover on that there's a sight glass. Make sure that sight glass is aligned over the fuel gauge. It's actually possible to put the cover on 2 different ways. One way you'll be able to see the fuel gauge, the other way you will not. You'll take the other 4 short bolts, and they will be used to hold the fuel tank cover in place. Take the 2 end plastic covers. One of them will have a label that says hot exhaust. That one obviously goes over the exhaust end. There is a foam gasket inside these. Just make sure that the gasket material has not popped out. It goes up through the grooves here. If it pulls out, just tuck it back into place. The end covers are the ones that use the longer bolts because they do have the spacers. There's metal inserts where it goes through the plastic. Hopefully, I will be able to get all the covers on before the phone rings again. This end, because I have the wireless remote installed already, is slightly trickier than if it did not. What I do is I route the antenna wire right through this recessed area. You notice it's indented right by the battery tray. The antenna wire I route through that recessed area, that way it's not pinched. This also has the foam gasket on this end. Just make sure that the foam gasket is still in place. check your antenna wire, and it still flows smoothly, so you know at that point it is not pinched. I put the antenna on top of the fuel cap. Reason being, the fuel cap is the highest point on a generator, and it's just like with a TV antenna. The higher up in the air you get it, the better your reception is. The rear cover, just make sure that your fuel gate or your fuel filter is up out of the way. Rear cover is held on with a single Phillips head screw. You simply tuck the two bottom tabs into place. The front cover is put on the same way. The only thing left is the decal, because of the way the Yamaha is laid out. My suggestion would be to put the decal either here or on the hatch cover. And this is simple operating instructions for the remote fuel kit, in case the person operating the generator is not the same person that installed it. Okay, the next part will be that the kit also includes a genuine Yamaha fuel hose. They're 10 feet long with quick disconnects on both ends, and an additional Yamaha quick disconnect fitting which goes in the fuel tank. I'll go ahead and demonstrate starting and running procedure with this tank. Like I said, you won't get one of these nasty hoses. You will get a genuine Yamaha fuel hose, which is 10 feet long instead of 7 feet long. The procedure for running the generator is, number one, make sure that there's fuel in the remote tank. Then take the prime bulb and make sure that the arrow on the prime bulb is facing in the direction of fuel flow, which means from the tank to the generator. Connect one end of the hose to the tank. Connect the other end of the hose to the generator. Make sure that the vent on the remote tank is open. Then move the fuel selector valve on the generator to the on position. Then pump the prime bulb until it feels firm. That usually takes about 3 or 4 pumps. What we're doing is just forcing the air that's in the hose up. It's pushing fuel into the hose, which pushes the air out of it, pushes it into the quick disconnect fitting, around, through the fuel filter, in through the fuel pump, and in with the fuel selector valve in the on position for priming it. It then puts fuel into the stock tank, and the air bubble is vented out through the stock fuel tank vent. Now that you've got the air bubble primed out of it, move the fuel selector valve to the off position. And think of the fuel selector valve as remote tank and stock tank. So the on position would be running off the stock tank normally, and you'd put it in the off position anytime you wanted to run off the remote tank. And after that, starting is very simple. This particular generator has my wireless remote control system on it, so the choking operation is completely automatic. So because of that, I won't be using the choke, but normally you would use the choke if you did not have my wireless remote on there. Shameless advertising plug for my wireless remote, by the way. And that's it. It's pretty straightforward and simple.